One of the main reasons we need to improve communication on challenging issues is because it's the only way to bridge our divides and solve important problems. One could reasonably ask why science can't do this job for us. The thinking goes, if we all agree to let science settle our squabbles, we will have definitive answers. And indeed, sometimes when faced with controversial questions, people will assert that they are just following the data and the empirical evidence. In some cases, that makes perfect sense. But it turns out that our positions on controversial topics are often nuanced and conflicted. And with or without data, our opinions on moral and political issues are subtle. Why won't data and empirical evidence bridge our ideological divides? We've all heard statistics, quoted statistics, and listened to them be thrown around aggressively. And we've seen that, to some extent, statistics can be bent to support a wide range of positions. If agreement on controversial issues were reachable by following data-driven or empirical arguments, we wouldn't have any reason to be divided on questions that can be scientifically answered. But that turns out to be a pretty complicated assertion. Consider this. In 2019, if I wanted to highlight the dire state of poverty in America, I could point to a study indicating that about 38 million people lived below the poverty line. And if I wanted to make the point that the state of poverty in America was not nearly as bad as people claimed, I could point to a study showing that if America's poorest 20% were their own nation, they'd be one of the richest nations in the world. Both claims are supported by data. Or consider a different controversial assertion. Gender is entirely a social construct. Can empirical evidence bring us to an agreement today on this? If I wanted to fill a library with evidence concluding that gender is a social construct, I could do so with little trouble. If I wanted to fill a second library with citations concluding that there's a biological basis for gender differences, I could do that too, and I could put it next to the first one. We may eventually come to a broad consensus, but we're not there now. Let's go into this example on gender with a little more detail. On topics that touch on identity, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality, the evidence we look for is shaded both by our intuitions and by the filters we use to interpret the world. Someone who sees society through a filter of identity-based power dynamics is likely to focus on, hear, and remember different evidence on the gender is a social construct question than someone who sees society as something closer to a meritocracy that rewards hard work and competence. Why does this matter? Well, we might ask why someone might seek to confirm the claim that gender is a social construct. If gender is entirely a social construct, then, for instance, differences between the sexes are also socially constructed. And if the differences are all socially constructed, then we can socially deconstruct them. That means that the only thing keeping, for instance, men and women in different occupations are socially constructed gender roles. Moreover, this means we'll know we've succeeded in breaking down those gender roles when the differences cease to exist. We could ask a parallel question about the other side. Why might someone be invested in rejecting the claim that gender is entirely a social construct? If there's a biological basis for gender differences, one could argue that the observed differences between the sexes are due to natural or genetic variation. And if those differences are genetic in nature, then we as a society can't do anything about them. Someone who wants to assert that women are genetically inferior to men or that women are inherently ill-suited for certain jobs or fields would most likely see their argument as supported by evidence that finds biological differences. For instance, if I want to argue that women are inherently less suited for leadership roles, I could try to support my position with evidence finding that women are naturally more nurturing than men are. I could go from there to say that the ability to nurture doesn't make someone a strong leader. So an important question is, how many people are there who have each of those two ideological motivations? I suspect that there are more people who prefer to deny biological differences for ideological reasons than confirm them for ideological reasons, but I certainly can't know for sure. This is why interpreting scientific evidence can be messy, and relying on it to bridge divides on controversial issues is probably not going to work. It's worth adding that those two viewpoints on gender represent a false dichotomy. No one has to choose between wholly inhabiting one or the other position, but that's how this and other issues are often presented. In the end, science can get the vast majority of us on the same page on many issues. For instance, most of us are perfectly happy, if sometimes confused, to update our understanding of whether eggs, chocolate, or red wine is good or bad for us based on the latest research. But evidence won't build consensus on issues that have a moral component or that touch questions of how to support the dispossessed or marginalized. The assumption underlying the idea that science will bridge divides is that if we all have the same information, we'd all think the same thing. But the reality is that even in a world in which everyone had perfect and identical information, we would still have very different opinions about how society should be structured. And that's a good thing.